Hey there! It gives me great joy to welcome you today to this day number 308. Today we read Ezekiel 41, Isaiah 17, and our second reading in Hebrews 11. Again, wonderful things for us to think about today. Let's dig deeper, starting with Ezekiel 41. Yesterday we started Ezekiel's account of his long vision about the future and ideal temple of God, and this is another vision that is referred to in the book of Revelation. The reason for this vision is given in chapter 43. Son of man, describe to the people of Israel the temple I have shown you, so they will be ashamed of all their sins. Let them study its plan, and they will be ashamed of what they have done. Ezekiel 41. Next the man took me into the central room, the holy place. He measured the passageway into it. It was 10 feet deep and 18 feet wide, with walls 8 feet thick on either side. He measured the room itself. It was 68 feet long and 34 feet wide. Then he went to the innermost room. He measured the passageway into it. It was 3 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with walls on either side 12 feet thick. He measured the room itself, and it was 34 feet square. The room was beyond the central room. Then he said to me, "This is the most holy place." Heading: The rooms built against the temple walls. The man measured the thickness of the inner wall of the temple building, and it was 10 feet. Against this wall, all around the temple, was a series of rooms 7 feet wide. These rooms were in 3 stories, with 30 rooms on each floor. The temple's outer wall on each floor was thinner than on the floor below, so that the rooms could rest on the wall without being anchored into it. And so the temple walls, when seen from the outside, seem to have the same thickness all the way to the top. Against the temple's outer wall, on the outside of the rooms, 2 wide stairways were built, so that it was possible to go from the lower story to the middle and upper stories. The outside wall of these rooms was 8 feet thick. There was 1 door into the rooms on the north side of the temple, and 1 into those on the south side. I saw that there was a terrace 8 feet wide around the temple. It was 10 feet above the ground, and it was level with the foundation of the rooms by the temple walls. Between the terrace and the buildings used by the priests, there was an open space 34 feet across, along the sides of the temple. Heading: The building on the west. At the far end of the open space on the west side of the temple, there was a building 150 feet long and 116 feet wide. Its walls were 9 feet thick all around. Heading: The total measurements of the temple building. The man measured the outside of the temple, and it was 168 feet long. And from the back of the temple, across the open space to the far side of the building to the west, the distance was also 168 feet. The distance across the front of the temple, including the open space on either side, was also 168 feet. He measured the length of the building to the west, including its galleries on both sides, and it was also 168 feet. Heading: Details of the temple building. The entrance room of the temple, the holy place, and the most holy place were all paneled with wood from the floor to the windows. These windows could be covered. The inside walls of the temple, up as high as above the doors, were completely covered with carvings of palm trees and winged creatures. Palm trees alternated with creatures, one following the other, all the way around the room. Each creature had 2 faces, a human face that was turned toward the palm tree on one side, and a lion's face that was turned toward the tree on the other side. It was like this all around the wall, from the floor to above the doors. The doorposts of the holy place were square. Heading: The wooden altar. In front of the entrance of the most holy place there was something that looked like a wooden altar. It was 5 feet high and 4 feet wide. Its corner posts, its base, and its sides were all made of wood. The man said to me, "This is the table which stands in the presence of the Lord." Heading: The doors. There was a door at the end of the passageway to the holy place, and one also at the end of the passageway to the most holy place. They were double doors that swung open in the middle. There were palm trees and winged creatures carved on the doors of the holy place, just as there were on the walls. And there was a wooden covering over the outside of the doorway of the entrance room. At the sides of this room there were windows, and the walls were decorated with palm trees. Now let's turn to Isaiah 17. Yesterday we finished the 2-chapter oracle concerning Moab. It was really not so much a prophecy of condemnation, but a lament for the people. Isaiah 17. Heading: God will punish Syria and Israel. The Lord said, "Damascus will not be a city any longer. It will be only a pile of ruins. The cities of Syria will be deserted forever. They will be a pasture for sheep and cattle, and no one will drive them away. Israel will be defenseless, and Damascus will lose its independence. Those Syrians who survive will be in disgrace like the people of Israel. I, the Lord Almighty, have spoken." The Lord said, "A day is coming when Israel's greatness will come to an end, and its wealth will be replaced by poverty. Israel will be like a field where the grain has been cut and harvested, as desolate as a field in Rephaim Valley when it has been picked bare. Only a few people will survive, and Israel will be like an olive tree from which all the olives have been picked, except 2 or 3 at the very top, or a few that are left on the lower branches. I, the Lord God of Israel, have spoken." Isaiah speaks. When that day comes, people will turn for help to their Creator, the Holy God of Israel. They will no longer rely on the altars they made with their own hands, or trust in their own handiwork, symbols of the goddess Asherah and altars for burning incense. When that day comes, well-defended cities will be deserted and left in ruins, like the cities the Hivites and Amorites abandoned as they fled from the people of Israel. Israel, you have forgotten the God who rescues you and protects you like a mighty rock. Instead, you plant sacred gardens in order to worship a foreign god. But even if they sprouted and blossomed the very morning you planted them, there would still be no harvest. There would only be trouble and incurable pain. Heading: Enemy nations are defeated. Powerful nations are in commotion with a sound like the roar of the sea, like the crashing of huge waves. The nations advance like rushing waves, but God reprimands them, and they retreat, driven away like dust on a mountainside, like straw in a whirlwind. At evening they cause terror, but by morning they are gone. That is the fate of everyone who plunders our land. Now let's return to Hebrews 11. The faith chapter of Hebrews is an exposition of the verse from Habbakuk 2, "And my righteous ones will live by fully believing in me." but I will take no pleasure in anyone who turns away. Hebrews 11, starting at verse 17. It was Abraham's belief in God's promise that moved him to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice when God put Abraham to the test. Abraham was the one to whom God had made the promise, yet he was ready to offer his only son as a sacrifice. God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that you will have the descendants I promised." Abraham reckoned that God was able to raise Isaac from death, and, so to speak, Abraham did receive Isaac back from death. It was Isaac's belief in God's promises that moved him to promise blessings for the future to Jacob and Esau. It was Jacob's belief in God's promises that moved him to bless each of the sons of Joseph just before he died. He leaned on the top of his walking stick and worshipped God. It was Joseph's belief in God's promises that moved him, when he was about to die, to speak of the departure of the Israelites from Egypt and leave instructions about what should be done with his body. Moses' parents believed in God's promises, and that is what moved them to hide him for 3 months after he was born. They saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's order. When Moses had grown up, it was his belief in God's promises that moved him to refuse to be called the son of the king's daughter. He preferred to suffer with God's people rather than to enjoy sin for a little while. He reckoned that to suffer scorn for the Messiah was worth far more than all the treasures of Egypt, so he kept his eyes on the future reward. It was his belief in God's promises that moved him to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt without being afraid of the king's anger. As though he saw the invisible God, he refused to turn back. The same beliefs moved him to establish the Passover and order the blood to be sprinkled on the doors, so that the angel of death would not kill the firstborn sons of the Israelites. It was the Israelites' belief in God that enabled them to cross the Red Sea as if on dry land. When the Egyptians tried to do it, the water swallowed them up. It was the Israelites' belief in God that made the walls of Jericho fall down after the Israelites had marched around them for 7 days. It was Rahab's belief in God that kept her from being killed with those who disobeyed God, for she gave the Israelite spies a friendly welcome. Should I go on? There isn't enough time for me to speak of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Their belief in God enabled them to overthrow other kingdoms. They did what was right and received what God had promised. They shut the mouths of lions, put out fierce fires, and escaped being killed by the sword. They were weak, but became strong. They were mighty in battle and defeated the armies of foreigners. By means of their full belief in God, women received their dead relatives raised back to life. Others, refusing to accept freedom, died under torture in order to be raised to a better life. Some were mocked and whipped, and others were put in chains and taken off to prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were killed by the sword. They went around clothed in skins of sheep or goats, poor, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not good enough for them. They wandered like refugees in deserts and hills, living in caves and holes in the ground. What a record all of these have won by means of their full belief in God and His promises. They did not receive what God had promised, because God had decided on an even better plan for us. His purpose was that only in company with us would they be made perfect. Please join me in prayer. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for all those faithful believers mentioned here that did not receive what they hoped for in this life. Thank you that not everyone worked miracles, not everyone was victorious, but others sound more normal, like us. They were stoned or killed or were poor, persecuted, and mistreated. As verse 13 says, all these people kept on fully believing until they died. They did not receive the things God had promised, but from a long way off they saw them and welcomed them, and admitted openly that they were foreigners and refugees on earth. Lord, give us a longer view, like Moses. As though he saw the invisible God, he refused to turn back. So, as the next chapter says, as for us, we have this large crowd of witnesses around us. So then, let us rid ourselves of everything that gets in the way, and of the sin which holds on to us so tightly, and let us run with determination the race that lies before us. Let us keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. So, Lord, today, as we do everything, may our gaze actually be on you.